cool computer glasses. Actually, these match my shirt. Okay, I'm going back to this. All right, good. I'm glad you're recording now, Mamik. We are underway. We are talking, welcome. We're talking about this book. We're discussing this book. Many of you have ordered this book. Some of you are reading this book. Jorgen, welcome. We are reading Developing the Leader Within You, 2.0. 2.0. So if you have that book, great. Hopefully you've read ahead. I am going to summarize the chapter and give you a number of questions to think about. And today we're talking about priorities. So if you're taking notes, priorities. I'm going to send you also a little printout from maxwellleader.com because they have some PDFs that track with this book. And there is one on priorities where you can kind of read through this, fill out a little chart about your life priorities. So it might be useful. I'll send that when we attach the recording to our email that goes out to everybody. Okay, is everybody feeling good after the semi-annual meeting? Yeah? Still feeling the glow and excitement of being together with people who are excited and motivated? Yes, people look motivated. All right, well, let's talk about your priorities, okay? Priorities, one of the keys to leadership. And Maxwell says in this chapter that really, if people said, well, what's that chapter about? Most people would say, oh, it's about time management. But John Maxwell would contend with you. He'd say, well, there's no such thing as time management. Time is something that's chronological. It marches forward with or without us. It happens. Everybody gets the same amount of time in a day, so you can't manage time. You can only manage what? Yourself. That's right. So you have to decide what's important and what do I focus on, and then you have to execute. If you do that, you're going to have a great career at LGFG. You're going to have a good life, but you have to know your priorities. And one priority is knowing purpose. You know, some of you joined me at the semi-annual meeting when we talked a little bit more about working purpose into your daily regimen. So if you've got your foundation correct and that priority set, then other priorities fall into place. So get excited. All right. Maxwell says most people overestimate the importance of most things. That's big point number one. Most people overestimate the importance of most things. Now that sounds a little redundant and confusing. Most things, in other words, are not that important. Many things aren't important, but sometimes we tend to feel like we need to do them. And there's a quote in the book that says, the art of being wise is knowing what to overlook. I like that. The art of being wise is knowing what to overlook. What do you not have to pay attention to? So that leads us to point 2 in his chapter, which says having too many priorities paralyzes people. Isn't that true? Have you ever had a time when you had too many priorities at once and you went into information overload and got stuck or paralyzed because I was just like, too much stimulation, too many things to do. He does tell an interesting story about how lion tamers operate, which has nothing to do with LGFG, but it's an interesting story. The way they train lions and a lion tamer works, he or she just doesn't walk into the cage and say, okay, pay attention to me. But they carry typically a chair that has 4 legs, right? And what the lion has to do, or does naturally, is it focuses on the 4 legs of the chair. And also there's the lion tamer in the background. So it doesn't quite know what to focus on. And because of that, the tamer can manipulate the situation and, as a bonus, stay alive. So that's just a thought in case you ever decide to leave the business and become a lion tamer. Bring a chair with you. Okay, so having too many priorities paralyzes people, which ties into the next big point. If you want to read the book, it's a lot more interesting than I'm just giving you the headlines, but that's what you want here. We're cutting to the chase. His third big point is when small demands are given too much attention, big problems arise. When tiny demands are given too much attention, big problems happen. So that means in our, if you remember back to Stephen Covey, our vocabulary about quadrant 3 and quadrant 4, those are things that are urgent but not important. If those become important on our mental radar, those urgent things that you don't have to do but you end up feeling like you need to, when those little demands become great, you start having problems because you just don't have enough time to do everything. How many people are busy? Okay, 3 of you. All right, well, the rest of you, I'd say work harder, okay? Or raise your hand. Here's another point, point number 4. Making everything a priority means nothing is a priority. Does that make sense? Making everything a priority, Maxwell says, means nothing's a priority. And you know what? That makes me think of our news cycle here in the U.S., particularly CNN. You obviously might get a version of CNN overseas, but here in America, CNN is focused every minute of the 24-hour news cycle on trying to impeach Donald Trump. They are bias is not the word, but they are excited about taking him down. So everything that they report is a crisis, a problem. This is it. We've got him now. And so since everything is this panic, people start to not pay attention. And CNN and cable news has dropped to the bottom of the barrel. No one even pays attention to them anymore because they're so hysterical all the time. Too many priorities. It's crazy. And they're behind the Food Network. We have a channel called the Food Network, and you can sit and watch people make food. So that tells you the problem of having everything as a priority all at once, all the time. Okay? So this leads to another point. The last of these points, by the way. Sometimes it takes an emergency for us to prioritize. Sometimes it does take an emergency for us to prioritize. And I don't know if you've been in or one of your family's been in a life-threatening circumstance or a car wreck or something happens, but when that happens to you, immediately your main priorities come to the surface. You don't go, oh my gosh, my brother was in a terrible car wreck. I wonder if I answered that email back to that client. You don't do that. I hope you don't do that, but you think about what's most important. I had a great friend of mine that died when he was 35. This was some years ago. And thankfully, he already had his life priorities in order. And he thought that through, on all levels. And so when he died, it was a very peaceful affair. But it was still sad, but it was a peaceful thing. But he already had prioritized what was most important to him in life. So it's good to think about this when it's not an emergency. That's why sometimes when I get with you, I'm talking about purpose. I'm talking about, what's your life about. Next week, we talk about character, which is huge, because that's never an emergency. You don't wake up in the morning and go, oh my gosh, today I've got to work on my character. So, get out paper. No one does that. But oftentimes an emergency makes us prioritize. And most people in the world, that's how they do prioritize. They do it when they're on their deathbed. So anyway, enough of that sad talk. Let's move ahead. There's another little section in this chapter called priority principles. So these are principles around priority. And some of these I'm making statements, and if you're jotting them down as a group, which I would love for you to do, these would be topics just to talk about in the group, because I know a lot of offices huddle when there's a break or free time, or you have a specific time when you talk about what we cover on our leadership calls and what's covered in the other weekly calls. So do that. I've got questions at the end for you to talk about. All right, first priority principle. Working smarter has a higher return than working harder. Working smarter has a higher return on investment than working harder. Now, when I was in my 30s and 40s and I was getting more and more projects and I was getting promoted and I had more responsibility and more leadership, I bumped up what Dan Sullivan calls the ceiling of complexity. The ceiling of complexity is a point at which you reach that you cannot do anymore yourself in your own power by adding more hours to the week to get goals accomplished. In other words, you have so many projects, so many tasks, so many family responsibilities that you bump up against a ceiling of complexity. Life is too complex. Has anybody hit that before? Maybe not. But yeah, you reach a point where you're just like, I mean, I guess I could work 90 hours a week, but then you sort of burn out. So the recommendation is let's figure out a way to break through that ceiling of complexity by working smarter. And one thing that's Dan Sullivan recommends that you surround yourself with people who have complementary skills so that you can focus on your unique ability, the thing that you do best. You know, I think that's one of the reasons behind having EAs is that they can take care of setting those appointments with repeat business so that you can focus on what you do really well. So that's something to think about. That's an example of breaking through the ceiling of complexity by working smarter. Okay, here's another point. The good is always the enemy of the best. The good is always the enemy of the best. Now this means, especially if you're a really helpful person and you like serving others and helping people and saying yes when people make requests of you, those are good things. I'm not saying don't do those or just focus on yourself. But a lot of times, if you say yes to all those things and you're helping other people, then you end up not focusing in on your main priority. So if you remember Covey said this, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. That's a quote I can remember because it's sort of repetitive. But the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And sometimes the good things that we do or the lower priority things that we feel like we need to do, they're the enemy of getting the main thing done. Okay? So ponder that. That's one to kind of talk about. All right, another point, another principle. Proactive beats reactive. Proactive beats reactive. And you're like, okay, what are you talking about? Think about the week before you go on holiday, before you go on vacation. Whenever you've done that, the week before you go on vacation, what's it like at the office? You're like getting things done, checking things off, getting your task list finished, answering all those emails, returning phone calls, making sure everybody's ready to go, delegating everything. Can you cover me if somebody, you're getting it all done so that when vacation comes, you can go and relax. So you're being super proactive right before a holiday. If you could somehow manage not to be frenzied, but if you could manage to be that focused with your priorities without having holidays coming up, you'd really get things done because you'd be focusing on all the priorities getting tied down. Okay? Something to think about. All right, last point on our principles. Important needs to take precedence over urgent. Maxwell says important stuff needs to take precedence, or it's more important than urgent stuff. Okay? Now remember our little box. We've got quadrant 1, which Covey calls high important and high urgency. A crisis, these are crisis situations. These are things you got to take care of. You must tackle these first. High important, high urgency. That'd be like one of your best clients calls and says, I need you to call me today. That would probably be a quadrant 1. If Dimitri calls and says, we need to talk this afternoon at 1 o'clock, you can't just go, well, I'll see if I can get around to it. No, that's high important and it could be urgent. So I would do that. So those are the things you got to focus on first in that quadrant. High importance, high urgent. All right. Now the next quadrant that we would love to focus on, and Maxwell says you got to spend some time here, is quadrant 2. And that's high important stuff, but low urgency. And these are things like planning, looking ahead at your calendar. Some of you guys do a great job of this. I know when I've talked to you, like Jorgen is a great planner when he can have some free time and an empty office and blank paper and a calendar to look at, he can kind of think through how things want to go. And that planning, or the time off when you're recharging your batteries emotionally, that is quadrant 2. That's very important, but it's not urgent. Okay? That's what everybody skips. Everybody gives that part up, and it will cost you at some point. Quadrant 3, these are things that are low importance but high urgency. Not important, but they seem urgent. And Maxwell says those things you just don't need to spend much time on. If you can delegate those to someone or ignore them, do it. And these are oftentimes requests from other people that don't fit in at all to your goals. So you got to figure out how to stay on top of that. And the final quadrant, quadrant 4, is low importance and low urgency. And he says don't even mess with them. You know, and I'm not saying quadrant 4 activity would be spending 4 hours straight on Instagram or staying up too late playing a video game instead of getting sleep. You know, I'm not saying those things are evil, but if they're done at the wrong time, if they're super low priority, but you're using, you know, again, you only have a certain amount of time in a day. If you're using that for quadrant 4, low important and not urgent stuff, it does catch up with you at some point. So enjoy yourself, but he would say just block off an hour of time a week if you have not important and not urgent stuff, and just chip away at it for 1 hour and then stop. Don't get lost in it. Okay, last little section we need to talk about is solutions. Solutions to your priority issues. So let's talk about the first one. One we have discussed before. It's called the Pareto principle. P-A-R-E-T-O. Remember the Pareto principle? Who remembers it? It's the 80-20 rule. Yeah, the 80-20 rule. Okay, and that just means that 80% of your production comes from 20% of your activities. So let me give you some examples right from the book. The 80-20 principle applies to almost anything. If you've got 10 things to do today, focus on the 2 most important, at 20%, and that will impact 80% of your productivity for the day. Okay? So 20% of the clothes that you wear, you wear 80% of the time. If you look at your closet. 20% of most sales forces in a company generate 80% of the production. 20-80 rule, Pareto principle. Let me give you some more that I thought were interesting. It says 20% of our time produces 80% of our results. 20% of the products bring in 80% of the profits. That's interesting. Jobs, 20% of our work gives us 80% of the satisfaction. That's one to talk about. How about taxes? 20% of the people pay 80% of the taxes. That may be different in different countries. Whatever. 80-20 rule still holds. Here's one that's true. Picnics. If you've been out on a picnic, 20% of the people will eat 80% of the food. Okay? So think about that if you're planning an outing. All right? So what do we do with the Pareto principle? Well, to figure out your top 20% of what to focus on, he says there are 3 R's. 3 questions, 3 R's you have to think for. I'll start with R, that's why. They're requirement, return, and reward. So number 1, what is required of me? That would be in your 20%. What do I have to do? Your job has responsibilities that are non-negotiable. Like you can't just say, like if you're in DeVal, you can't just say, you know what? I'm just not coming to work. That is a non-negotiable for employment. So that's required of you. If you're a booking buddy and you're saying, you know what, I just don't really feel like making phone calls, then you would have a short-lived employment status, because that is a non-negotiable. That's required. All right. So that's the first question. That goes in your top 20%. That produces your 80%. Next question. What gives me the greatest return? What gives me the greatest return? And what I mean by that, what do people continually like compliment you on? What do you do really well that adds to your 80% productivity? What tasks do your teammates or office mates ask you to take on because you're good at them? Like you might be a really good trainer. So they might say, hey, can I listen to your phone calls? Or if you follow someone, if you're a clothier in turf, you might want to observe them, and because you do it by the script, by the book, and that really helps people. So think, what gives me the greatest return as a person at LGFG? Third question, what is most rewarding? That's the third R. What is most rewarding? In other words, in my job, what do I enjoy most? Like some of you might really enjoy, I don't know, measuring clients. Who knows? Well, I'm picking stuff. I doubt that could be the case. But if you're thinking, I was born for this, because you really get exhilaration from that activity, that may be in your 20% that does the 80% of your output. Okay, so what's required, what gives the greatest return, and what is most rewarding? That's a great way to figure out what do I need to focus on in my priorities. All right, here's the last major point, and then I've got questions for you to talk about. And you can talk too if you like. You can actually unmute yourself. I'm happy for that. It's up to you. So write this down. Make room for margin. Maxwell says make room for margin. What is margin? A guy named Swenson says this: margin is the space between our load and our limits. The space between our load and our limits is your margin. And the people who have margin is the opposite of overload. Okay? So if you've ever been so overloaded by work and responsibilities and stuff going on that you have no time for yourself, that means you have zero margin. That's what I'm talking about. So you have to build margin into your schedule. You have to plan this into your schedule. This is what we talked about a minute ago. Quadrant 2 activities: planning, thinking, reflecting on your last week. Why was it not good? Those are all margin activities, quadrant 2 activities. So you've got to put it into your calendar or it won't happen. It's going to get covered up by all your other requests and activities, and I got to do this, and oh my gosh, my task list, and oh, this is what I didn't get done last week. Carry it over to this week. You just get covered up. So Maxwell says it, and I agree. It's absolutely important for you to create margin for yourself. Write this down, and this is still under the heading of margin. Activity does not equal accomplishment. Activity does not equal accomplishment. How many of you have you've spent time being super active, or you know someone that's like really active all the time, but they don't get anything done? Yeah? Man, if that's you, it's really frustrating because you're like, I'm really working hard. And Maxwell would say, yeah, you're just working on the wrong stuff. Priorities, the main thing, okay? So margin gives you needed think time, because you got to think, what am I doing? What can I improve? What have I done? What is a strength? What's my weakness? How can I tweak this? Margin gives you think time, and it gives you energy. Here's the problem. As you move up the chain of command, all leaders have a bias for action. You know what I mean? They are biased toward action. They are not typically reflective. I'm going to sit and think for a couple hours. No, they want to do things, make things happen, get things done. You know, rebuild, pipe drive, whatever. There's just things to do all the time. Go, 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 go. You know, that's what leaders tend to have a bias towards. But if you're not building margin in, then if there's no planning, there's no creation time in your mind. If there's very little thinking ahead, there's no margin, and eventually just flying by the seat of your pants, as we say here in the States, it catches up to you and things start to fall apart. And you start missing meetings, or you're always late to stuff, or you're like, oh yeah, that we were going to talk on a conference call, but I don't have time anymore. Something else has come up. You just get covered up. So you have to build margin, make room for margin. I think I hit that pretty well. Okay, now I'm going to give you 4 questions, and I'll shut up. Number 1, these are discussion topics. Where do I need to work smarter instead of harder? That's question 1. Where do I need to work smarter instead of harder? Now, as I ask that question, let me say this. If this is your first or second year and you're just learning how to do the business, then you just need to work hard, okay? Don't try to think, oh yeah, here's this little cool little shortcut I can do. No, you just work hard. You do the grind. You do the script. You suck it up. You're coachable, period. So you don't have to worry about that first question. Just work hard, okay? Now, question 2. What good things can I stop doing in order to do the best things? Remember, the good, sometimes the enemy of the best. So what are some good things I can stop doing in my schedule in order to do the best things, the higher priority? That's question 2. And some of you stop doing some things, and that's good. It clears your plate. Number 3, what must I do to become more proactive instead of reactive? What do I do to be proactive, to take charge and be in control of my life rather than just reacting to everything and all the time? And here's my last question. Thanks for acting like you're writing these down. I'm sure you are. What can I do to stop doing urgent but unimportant things? Hard one. What can I do to stop doing, or easier way to say it, how can I stop doing urgent but not important things? Okay? So today, the topic was priorities. How can we keep the main thing the main thing? And I want you to kind of kick around some of these ideas and chat about them. Or if you're in an office alone and you have no friends, that's fine too. You can just think about these things. Okay? Good. Okay. Comments, questions, input. Any of you older guys who've made changes along the line of priorities and it helped you, that you could share a story or something like that? You can. Or anybody have a question? Yeah. You know, one of these times on a Monday, I am going to actually have a topic of rocket science. And then if we finish and you don't have any questions, and I've talked about rocket science for 30 minutes, I'm going to be pissed. Because, but most of these principles, these leadership ideas are simple enough that you can get them up here. The main idea is, how can I implement them? All right. So without further ado, I will let you go. We will talk again next week about character, and I will send you, I think, a PDF if I can pull it up along with the recording, and that might help you on this notion of priorities. Thanks for what you do. Stay focused. Keep the main thing the main thing. Until next week. See you.